Today, we're exploring Indigenous experiences, history, and the ongoing journey towards truth and reconciliation. Our guest today is Maeengan Linklater, Anishinaabe from the Lac Seul Nation in Ontario. With more than 25 years of experience across the not-for-profit, government, and private sectors, he is a father, community leader, and poet. In this episode, we'll discuss the painful legacy of residential schools, the lasting impact on Indigenous communities, and the work being done to uncover truth, honor survivors, and move towards reconciliation. We'll also touch on lesser-known aspects of this history, including unconventional psychic tests on Indigenous children at residential schools. Today's conversation invites us to listen, reflect, and think critically about the path forward. Join us as we get rebelliously curious. Maeengan, thank you so much for joining me on Rebelliously Curious. As I was saying to you just before we started recording this interview, I have been fascinated with the Indigenous community in general. Since being a Canadian myself, I live in Toronto, and I've been watching the truth and reconciliation movement that's been happening over the years, which is finally happening with the Indigenous peoples, but also just finally happening within Canada. So first of all, I'd like to welcome you on the podcast and thank you very much for joining me today.
Sure. Thank you. I'm happy to be here.
So let's start off for people that are watching this podcast. Lots of people from the States and all over the world watch this show. And so they might wonder, what is truth and reconciliation? What is that and what does it mean?
So truth and reconciliation within that's happening here in Canada stems from the government policies of the Indian residential school policies and programs that were in place and imposed upon Indigenous, First Nations people way back in the past century. And by that, the Canadian government had taken First Nations children from their homes and placed them in the schools to educate them in the Western philosophies and thinking for pretty much 10 months of the year. And in these schools, a lot of bad things happen to the students. A lot of sexual, physical, emotional abuse that occurred to them. Especially when they're from a young age until they graduated for the most part. So, and over 100,000 First Nations students went to these schools, and as a part of that, there are these court cases that were going through the system, and settlements occurred out of that. And so there was settlements for the survivors of these schools to compensate them for, again, the policies of the Canadian government, which recently, I think in 2004 or 2023, I think the Parliament of Canada recognized Indian residential schools as a genocide and made a motion for the government of Canada to recognize the Indian residential school genocide. So just to provide that in the context.
Yeah, it is a genocide. Over 10,000 children were found, 10,000 and more, and hopefully still not counting. It is a tragedy that has not been talked about for a very long time, within Canada. And now it is. And communities around the world are speaking about it too. This is not just a Canadian thing. There is residential schools in the United States as well. And I'm not sure if the American community really does understand, that this was happening both in Canada and the United States.
That I'm not sure, but I do know that I think there was some movement there, I think, on the Indian boarding schools in the United States there, I think under the previous, Joe Biden. I know that there was talk about the experience down there. But I do know, like in Canada, this is where things are at. And so the movement towards reconciliation, I think, there's now the September 26th, which is the day for truth and reconciliation here. So that's one thing that has come out of that, where there's opportunities for commemoration, remembrance, and honoring of the the folks, but also the survivors and and their descendants as well. So.
Right. It's a day that should be remembered,
Mhm.
and a day that we can take a moment to respect the Indigenous community. I have found myself in the most interesting space, you know, understanding residential schools and been following this narrative, and looking at truth and reconciliation. One of the things, though, that I had been researching myself is, and weirdly enough, there might be a connection here, has been the MK Ultra cases, both in Canada and the United States. And what led me to your work and your interviews with CBC was this psychic testing that was being done the psychic testing that was being done
Yeah.
on Indigenous children. And
Mhm.
you found a 1943 journal of parapsychology, and it talked about these ESP experiments. Can you talk a little bit more about how you found this journal, and then what were some of these experiments that were done and why?
So this was, I guess, this is like over 10 years ago. So give me, my
Yeah.
memory is kind of a bit sketchy here, but I wanted to sort of, again, the opportunity to sort of go back into that frame of mind. But back in the days, so 10 years ago, I was employed as the Aboriginal program coordinator for the Canadian Museum for Human Rights, and during that time period as well, what what I went through, I was at this festival in Winnipeg, and a part of that was this little bookstore that they had, and and at this bookstore at this festival, I was looking through some books, and there was this book by Chris Witowski,
Oh, I know
and
Chris. No,
yeah, yeah,
really?
yeah. Mhm.
Really? It was Chris. Okay, sorry.
Yeah. And as a result, I mean, he, had this blurb, um, creepy Canada, or creepy tales of Canada, or had creepy in the title. And as I was just perusing through the book, I bought it, and I was just spending the afternoon, Saturday afternoon, reading about it. And then there was this blurb about, the study on Brandon First Nation students at the Brandon Indian Residential School. And I was like, this is really strange. But considering that I had access to all of these academic journals where I was working at, I made some inquiries. I said, "Can you find this study?" And when I found it, um, and then I think I went to the press. I think it was released on the CBC, Washington Post, APTN. I think there was a wide range of national exposure that brought light to the story here, in terms of what of ESP students that were test subjects back in the 1940s, and this would have been during, I think, possibly during the Second World War. And so a lot of the effort there was towards, the war effort. And so, but Brandon Indian Residential School had a really horrible, horrible, horrible reputation, even with I guess the war efforts going on, and the austerity efforts from other, supports for government programs. But when it came to Brandon, yeah, yes, these studies were imposed upon the children without the lack of ethical standards that would happen today, especially with respect to um, children, that and consent. Because these children were, had been apprehended from their villages, and they were, asked to participate in these studies. Of course, what are they going to do? They're not going to say no, because of the fact that there's this massive power imbalance between adults and children. And the study had been conducting on them. And of course, they were rewarded with candy, I do believe, and that was that. So it, yeah. And so in hindsight, when Chris had written the book, I do believe in 1998, there were, just the stories of Indian residential schools wasn't as prevalent, nor as in depth, nor with the understanding of the context of how it is perceived today. Now we know with Indian residential schools, it's a genocide, and recognized by the by Parliament and described by the Pope. But back in the day, these schools were just known, but nobody knew what had gone behind the closed doors, or behind the photographs of smiling children and all of that stuff there. So that essentially was, what was really the, I guess, the spark that created, the awareness of, at least in this snapshot in time, of what had happened to these children in the 1940s. And so as a result, I mean, I think with the media coverage that came out of that, close to 1 million people would have potentially have seen the article, the news article, and were aware of that. And so I guess, in a sense, when it comes to, truth and reconciliation, this was, a truth that came out, and it's there. It exists as a reminder that this happened, and it's not meant to, make people feel guilty or feel sad. I mean, it's obviously, it is sad, but it's just, it happened. It's part of Canadian history. It's part of Canadian and First Nations relations. And so out of that, it just serves that, this type of stuff happened, and it has happened in different parts of the country. And there's been a variety of different studies as well, right? I think there was, I think there were some food studies that were conducted, I think back, something to that effect. I'm not sure where, but it did elicit, other reactions in other parts of the country, with, I guess, academic experts who, have been studying the issue. But in terms of my involvement, like I said, it was just a chance encounter that I was at this this festival. There was like I said, a bookstore that was there that happened to be selling these books. Picked it up because, I know Chris, and I had a really wanted to find out more about what had happened, with some of the stories that he had found with respect to other ghost stories and other things happening in Manitoba. But again, the very fact that there was something there that was specific to Manitoba and to residential schools before we became aware of residential schools. That essentially is, how I came to be. So I don't really feel myself that I did anything special. I just said, here's the story that happened, and this is an occurrence that happened in Canadian and First Nations history.
Yeah, you brought it to light, though. It's so important because a lot of people don't know that the last residential school was, I believe, 96. It was the 90s that the
Mm-hmm.
last one closed. And like within my lifetime, I was going to date my age. I
Mm-hmm.
believe I was 12 when the last one closed, around there. And
Mm-hmm.
it's so sad to know that it was still happening for that long. The funny thing is Chris Rakowski. I have known Chris for years. I
Yep.
podcast about UFOs and a lot of frontier science, like warp drive
Mm-hmm.
technology that we're looking at, that are theoretical theories that are on the table right now. So I'm always talking to people within very interesting spaces. But I never thought that you would say Chris Rakowski, out of all the people in Canada that I know that
Okay.
found that story and spoke about it, would be him. Uh,
Mm-hmm.
it's such an interesting connection. I had to put that forward. But
Yeah.
yeah, sorry, please, you're going to say something?
Yeah, no, I think, I mean, the literary community is quite small, right? And I think,
Fair enough.
just as I think, just in terms of just, you know, um, and I had known, Chris from our involvement with the Winnipeg Writers, or the Manitoba Writers Guild. And so just through that connection, it's like, okay, once I found the book, found the story, it's like, oh, Chris, I know. I should pop in an email, maybe ask him to see if he can, if he has, the article. So I did go through I guess, the investigative process to sort of figure this out, and if he had that type of access. But no, but luck would have it, I had access to these academic journals. So
It's amazing.
mhm.
in the past, we've seen a lot of testing on Indigenous peoples and Indigenous students.
Mhm.
Why do you think that these like psychic abilities were chosen to be tested on Indigenous students? We know that potentially one could be for the fact that, they were in a school and it was easy to access that system and access them because they didn't have any parents around them or any real parental guidance, to be honest. So I could see that being one, but is there anything within Indigenous culture that would point to more of psi abilities and them being more curious within the Indigenous communities?
You know, I don't know. And like I said, when it came to the rationale for the story, or the rationale for the study, um, I don't have any type of I don't have any type of knowledge in terms of doing the deep dive in terms of who these individuals were. To me, it was just like, wow, this is a story that needs to be shared and be made. And again, just stemming from the fact that the dark history of Canadian history and First Nations as it relates towards this genocide, it's just like this is just is one of those things that we just need to bring light. I think in terms of um, how you have children that don't have the power um, to fight for themselves, and they have to accept the institution that they're in. It really lends to themselves that they need to create and to protect themselves as children. I know that it was told to me that my father, when he was a child in residential schools, his role was to protect his nephews and his cousins and his brothers and his sisters who were younger than him. And so he had to fight a lot, and he had to stick up for his family members because they didn't have their parents for protection. So to me, when we talk about the elders beyond my parents and their grandparents, who've gone through these horrific schools, and the impacts. Like, I don't speak my language, but my son, is a language protector, and he's now teaching at the University of Winnipeg. But he is, the first generation, not having to deal with the Indian residential school system. My mother went to residential schools, and she made a conscious effort for me not to go to these schools. So I view myself in my generation as the prototype generation in a post-Indian residential school environment. But really, when it comes down to my children, and or my child, that I view that as an opportunity for them to know that with him being successful at where he's at, and my step nephews and my step sisters and the younger generation of that time, and the successes that they are having with their careers, really makes me believe that that we should have been doing this 100 years ago. Really fostering First Nations family to really be there for their families, to be able to be in their communities, so that they are able to flourish and to be successful as community members, but also there to really celebrate their culture, their heritage, and their nation, because there's still lots of challenges of having to deal with, folks that don't necessarily have that strength and the opportunities. I'm a lucky guy. I'm employed. I've been around the world. I've had opportunities to embark upon lots of adventures, and I've been able to do that with my mother. I've been able to do that with my son, and even with the sign the sign behind me, where we age by stories and not by years, it really is true. And so when we talk about what Indian residential schools mean, in a post without them around, we need to really support the new generation, in order for them to achieve their dreams.
And the oral traditions as well, that within the Indigenous communities, residential schools before any documentation, I would imagine the oral, stories and traditions and the oral stories that were going on were horrendous. Like hearing victims speak now and watching interviews with them, like it broke my heart. I remember watching it on my birthday, and I was like, I don't know if these are the things I should
Mhm.
watch on my birthday, but it was breaking my heart. And I can imagine the oral stories that were told throughout the community before this was brought to light.
Well, I mean, when we're talking about, I think when any type of person that has gone through, a horrible experience, and they're going through the effects of post-traumatic stress disorder and whatnot, I believe that, it's not necessarily something that people would want to talk about. Like you hear stories of, war veterans that say that, can say that they served in certain conflicts, but the last thing that last thing that they'd want to talk about is their experiences in that environment. And I would not, want to be in a position where I would want to, be there with an Indian residential school survivor and to ask them what happened, because that is a place I would not want to. That's a space that I don't want them to find themselves back in, and to find themselves, in an environment where they were vulnerable as children, because they could definitely remember those experiences decades ago. And just to honor that space is just to know that, I don't want to, place myself in that type of position, because, I'd rather be I'd rather enjoy who they are, and the life that they've celebrated, to, make amends with themselves, but also just to um, understand that, they are in a loving environment, and they're being honored for who they are and the experiences of what they've gone through. To me, I think that is the single thing. The one thing that we can do is just to acknowledge what had happened to them. But you know what? They've had whatever that they've done with their lives. I hope that I hope it's a magical place for them, just in terms of being able to, provide for their families, in a manner that they would not want for them to experience. And I think any generation, seeks that, for the new generation that's coming up. And again, with my mother being what she had done with me, and not being in a residential school, that I consider myself very lucky, because I know that, I don't know what I would do without having my mother around, and not being with my family. But I know that, um, going back home, when we had the opportunity to celebrate, going back home for the summer or for holidays, it was always a beautiful time and a joyous time for me and my mother. But again, just being able to spend and to be with my mother, as close as we are, it's been a joyous experience for us. And as she's been able to get older, and again, we've been able to travel the world, through a variety of different places, and to share those experiences with my son, to me, I think is really, the experiences of being able to document that and to share those memories, because I envision that when my son is 80 years old, 90 years old, and his great grandchildren are, looking at old pictures, and he's like, what kind of family are we? And he could say, well, let me look. Let's look at these pictures of when I was, in my 20s, and here's me and my dad, and your Gokum, and this is us in front of the pyramids of Egypt. This is us in front of the Eiffel Tower. This is us in the Austrian Alps. And I want him to know that he can say, with 100% and with 100% accuracy, that he comes from a family of adventurers, and his children, will be able to carry that spirit moving forward, because of the fact that, this is what these are the memories that we have created together. And I think if there's anything that is stemming from the Indian residential schools, is that we need to we need to have that environment for First Nations communities to flourish. We need to have those supports in place in order for the next generation to create those opportunities for themselves, but also for their families. Because ultimately, when it comes down to being able to create memories, positive memories, you're ultimately creating and planting seeds for further growth and for further growth for other First Nations people out there.
It was beautifully said. It was so
Thank you.
beautifully said. It's important because we carry trauma within our DNA. And so when we have generations after generations that have gone through such horrible situations, we are going to feel it for the next generations to come. So you are right, creating those new memories, creating those positive memories. It's going to stay within your son's DNA, yours, and then for the next generations to come too, for the Indigenous communities and for First Nations people. So it's such a great way of saying it too. Thank you.
Not a problem.
I'm curious to know why you think that these types of testings were done, these psi testings. Did they ever say why they were doing this?
Nope, not that I'm aware of. Yeah, like I said, to me, I think it was just horrific the fact that without any type of ethical standards, um, this occurred.
Well,
Um,
yeah, it's funny because when I look at the timeline, the reason why I bring MK Ultra up because you see this consistent timeline. You know, these psi tests that were happening to Indigenous youth were in 1943 and then 1944 around that time. And then we look at MK Ultra that was actually starting around the Cold War as well, right? That was really the first
mhm.
time because we saw that the Soviets were looking at doing some form of testing too on their people. And then we
Yeah.
see these programs that were going, from 1947 to 1970s. We see the 1950s with the Cold War. 1950 was Bluebird. 1951 was Project Artichoke, and then 1973 was MK Ultra. So all of this is so connected to even the Indigenous students testing as well. It's all in the same timeline, and this was happening in Canada as well, MK Ultra, and then obviously the Indigenous students that were having the side testing. But I find it really interesting, and this is how I came across this story because I was like, what other testing has been done on humans and on people that has been against their will? And we've seen this consistency. Then we also hear stories within the 1980s that these programs were still happening. And the question now is, are there offshoots of these programs still happening today to people? And if so, where? It's hyper against the law.
Yeah.
And some people would say no, and a lot of the MK Ultra documents were destroyed. But I wonder because we have heard echoes of people saying that they were tested on as students. And this was even earlier closer to 2010.
Mm.
So these things are still happening from what I'm hearing. And, it's so unfortunate that the Indigenous population was targeted first. And then now, we see these offshoots still potentially.
I can't provide you with an answer with the answers that you're seeking. Just because of the fact that to me, with respect to just finding the story and just bringing it up to a wider audience, I think is how I feel my role in this. I just want to be clear when it comes to Indian residential schools. Like, there's no glory in Indian residential schools. There's it's to me, it's not something there that. I talk about on a regular basis. It's to me, I think it's very close, and it's very close to my family. It's very close with my mother and my father. Um, just because of the fact that I didn't go to the residential schools, it doesn't mean that I still had to deal with the echoes of these schools. And that's why it's very important to me, when it comes to my son and his fiance and his new family that they're going to be creating. I want to make sure that they don't have to deal with the stuff that my parents had to deal with, and I definitely don't want him to go through what I went through. So when it comes to these other big studies that have happened by different types of governments. I'm at a yeah. I'm not in a position to comment on that stuff, but I can focus on what I is that's in front of me. And again, with respect to my family, that's my focus.
That makes sense. No, I see the parallels in it, and your family has been affected, and it's affected many First Nations and Indigenous peoples for
Yeah.
for generations within Canada and also around the world. So I the reason why I bring those up because I we see a lot of past programs that have affected civilians done by government hands,
hmm
and it breaks my heart, and to know that these things can still be happening to anybody to any degree is immensely against the law, but that doesn't stop people from doing these horrible acts. And that's why when we see these connections, and we hope that there is nothing going on,
Yeah.
that's we very much do, but we know that that might not always be the case. And we don't really find out what has actually happened from years to come later on, from 20 to 30 to 40 years later. We hear about the different atrocities. So,
Yeah. No. No. Like I said, it it happened. I found a book, brought it to a larger audience, and obviously 10 years down the road, we're having this conversation about what it all meant. And I think I could definitely truthfully say that over the past span of 10 years, I've worked very hard for my son, from where he was just a young little boy to where he's at, and he's successful. And I think when we talk about my mom, his mom, the extended family that we have, we've all played a role in providing supports for the younger generation to flourish. Being able to provide them with the knowledge and the skills and the experiences for them to say, yeah, this is what I would like to do, and this is where things are at. Just in terms of, again, having the opportunity to provide for them. And again, I'm a very, very lucky man to be where I'm at.
oh yeah, immensely. And I think in changing so many people's lives, so many First Nations people's lives to come.
Thank you.
When watching some of the testimonies coming from, victims and people of First Nations peoples, where you're hearing the atrocities that were happening in residential schools, for people that don't understand and maybe have just said, oh, I've heard of Truth and Reconciliation, but I don't really know how severe it was as a residential school, and being at a residential school. Can you speak to those severities and those atrocity that did happen to those students that were there?
So a couple of years ago, the House of Parliament in Canada recognized Indian residential schools as a genocide, and directed the government of Canada to do that as well, because you had thousands, tens of thousands of First Nations students that were apprehended from their villages and their homes, placed in these schools for 10 months of the year to a full months of the year, and they were there to learn Western ideology, Western perspectives, and to learn English. And they were forbidden from learning their own languages, or even forbidden to learn their own way of life. And compounded on that was that they suffered physical, sexual, and emotional abuse. So to me, that is a dark history in Canadian history. It happened. And it's only now that there's been a movement towards truth and reconciliation here in Canada. So that essentially, in a nutshell, is what has happened. And so when with the survivors of these schools, again, they're in their 70s, they're in their 50s or their 60s. Again, after the last residential school closed in 1996. That would have been, they would have been potentially, after the age of 50, and so forth. So,
how does this research then play into ongoing reconciliation efforts within Canada?
well, I think there's now a movement towards having Indigenous research methods that post-secondary institutions use, that respect the community and respect the nations and to respect the way they do things there. I think when it comes to information, there are principles such as OCAP, which is ownership, control, access, and possession. And that is, one of the I guess, research set of values that are in place. And of course, there's probably other Indigenous research methods out there that do their best to ensure that you're not having these white settler academics coming in to do the research and then scooching out back to their ivory towers. I think there's a bit more sensitivity in terms of how they go about in terms of their research methodologies, but I'm not sure. I wouldn't know. I'm not a researcher, but I think I do know that when it comes to knowledge and information, there is definitely a respect towards ownership, control, and access and possession.
Now, within the Truth and Reconciliation in Canada, there's 94 calls to action. I'm not going to have you name 94 calls, but can you explain what these 94 calls to action are?
So the 94 calls of action essentially are, I guess, a set of actions that the government of Canada is going to be doing to, I guess, promote and achieve reconciliation with First Nations in Canada, as it relates towards in addressing the effects of the Indian residential schools. So it runs the gamut from, I think, child and family services to education, to economic development, access to museums, especially with respect to the Canadian state and the variety of different departments that they have, and how it fits within a multitude of different programs and services that they offer throughout the different departments that they have. So essentially that's where what they're have embarked upon.
Awesome, and rightfully so. And like there's at least a guideline that they're going by.
Yeah. So it's a work in progress, I guess. But like I said, for me, I think it comes down to reconciliation. And I think it's just a matter of to me, when it comes to Canadians here and how they view First Nations, I think it's just understanding that, yeah, bad things happened. It was a genocide. And as a result, if we want to have successful First Nations people and communities, we need to support those efforts, because at the end of the day, it's also going to contribute to a stronger Canada as well. So to me, when it comes to truth and reconciliation, yeah, the truth is there. Let's call it what it is. But from there, let's see what we can do about working, living together with respect to who we bring and what we bring to the table with respect to our personal histories and our cultures and our different languages.
It's amazing. And understanding, right, that the past has happened and we don't forget that, and we remember it so that it doesn't happen again. But there also is a chance to move forward and to have progressive change. Yeah,
absolutely. Yeah.
Thank you so much for being rebelliously curious with me today.
Thank you.